Okay, everyone, welcome to the first office hours webinar. So office hours are 30-minute webinars to help you successfully achieve CIP certified. From December through May, we'll host 6 of these webinars to touch all 14 chapters of the standards. And CIP certified staff and experts will be online to help answer your questions. So some general tips for completing your application this year: do your requirements first, since these are often the more difficult questions and you must achieve them to get CIP certified. Hit your management enhancement second and answer the ones that you can, and then keep a list of the ones that you can achieve later. And use the photos list. So it's a list of all of the standards questions that require photos. Take this with you when you go around your property and take your photos. And I will put that link in the chat for you guys. Let me see that. Okay. So each of these office hours webinars is going to focus on 2 to 3 chapters, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. We'll call out the standard by number so you know exactly which questions we're talking about. While each of the office hours focuses on specific chapters, feel free to bring any questions that you have. Just be sure to refer to a specific standard number, for example, 5.4.1, so that we can pull it up. And all of these webinars will be recorded, and we'll post them to the info hub on cipcertified.org. And if it's your first year getting CIP certified, just know that it will take about 60 to 80 hours to document the standards your first year. And also know that you're not alone. We are all here to help answer your questions, provide you with resources, and help in any way that we can along the way. And then once you're certified, you can expect to invest just 20 hours per year to do your application. So this first office hours webinar will cover chapters 3, Winery Facility Establishment Management, and 4, Vineyard Soil Conservation and Surface Water Quality. And we're joined today by 2 members of the Niner Wine Estate team. We have Craig McMillan, the Critical Resource Manager, and we have Molly Bullum, their winemaker. And Niner's Vineyards have been certified for over 10 years, and their winery was the first ever winery to be CIP certified. So Craig and Molly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Of course. Okay, so I will put the link for those first 2 chapters into the chat in case anyone wants to pull them up and follow along. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Molly, and we will start with chapter 3.
Okay, so chapter 3 is Winery Facility Establishment and Management, which is a great place to start because it's kind of the basis. It's the infrastructure. It's all the things that you have to kind of work with as far as your requirements, and also a lot of management enhancements. So there's only one requirement for this chapter, and that is that your ventilation system must be designed to handle all chemicals and gases involved in wine production. So to me, this includes everything from CO2 production to maybe chemicals that you keep on hand in storage. So having the ventilation system requirements is, it could be in multiple forms. It could be having a fume hood in your lab for any kind of chemicals that you're using in the laboratory setting. It could be your chemical storage room, just making sure you have some kind of ventilation system in there, whether it's an actual exhaust fan or just having it be able to be opened up to the air, have some airflow through there. And I think with CO2, of course, it's a huge issue during fermentation and the dangers that present themselves with CO2 in the winery setting. So having either a designated exhaust fan built into your winery, or you can get portable fans that will kind of evacuate CO2 from a room or from a tank. Or again, just having like cross ventilation and airflow through your winery could also satisfy this requirement, I believe. So there's a number of ways to do it, hopefully without having to retrofit your winery or put in a lot of extra infrastructure.
Okay, so then going through chapter 3, what do you think are some of the more difficult, well, since that's the only requirement, some of the more difficult management enhancements that may take a little more time and preparation?
Yeah, I think that it really depends on if you're working with an existing facility or if you're kind of in the construction phase where you can take advantage of some of these management enhancements that talk about working with consultants and planning ahead and that kind of stuff. So if you're working with an existing building, maybe it's just an old warehouse and it doesn't have a lot of fancy stuff. So maybe skipping over some of those and working with some of the other management enhancements might get you a leg up. But a lot of it does have to do with winery construction. So if you're working with an existing building, but you're kind of new to that building, finding somebody that has some institutional knowledge about what happened during the construction would be a huge help, because I know that when I came on board, the winery was 5 years old. And I had to find people that were here, and I had to find the plans, and I had to figure out from people that were actually here at the time what happened, and did we recycle our winery construction waste, and all that stuff. So if you've got somebody that you can go to on your staff, or even somebody that was there during the construction, I think that would be a huge help to answer a lot of these management enhancement questions in chapter 3.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the thing about these standards that touch facilities and the vineyards that are already there in place. It is going to be a lot of kind of digging back into the history and finding the things that you need to actually document the standards. So what about some of the easier management enhancement points that are easier to document and even change some of your practices to achieve them?
Yeah, I think as I look through it, one of them is so chapter 3.1, number 3 asks, is your building located to take advantage of solar orientation for daylighting, passive heating, and or cooling? And maybe if you're already working with an existing building that didn't have that necessarily in the design, I think there's ways you can kind of work your practices into that. So maybe when you receive your fruits, you put it on the shady side of the building just to kind of keep it cool. I think there's, it talks about window glazing in that number 5. Maybe that wasn't built into the facility, but you could always put some kind of like a film on your windows to provide some shading. So I think there's a lot of ways. I think sometimes you just have to get a little bit creative and think about how you're doing things and what you actually have to work with your building, and try to figure out a way that you can maybe change your practices, or again, I think it's just like being creative and looking at all the options. And a lot of times these questions have good examples of things that you maybe didn't consider before. So I would just read through the question, and then again, the Vineyard team is great if you have questions or you're really stuck with something. A lot of times maybe they have heard from somebody else that, oh yeah, they cut through this question by looking at this, the specific example, and sometimes it's something that you would never have thought of before, but somebody else did it and it worked. So I think there's a lot of ways to satisfy these management enhancements.
It's something to keep in mind for both the vineyard establishment chapter and also this winery establishment chapter is that because there are so many management enhancements, because we know that a lot of times these properties or facilities were established before someone is choosing to go through the certification program. So they're there to allow for flexibility. So if you feel like you're kind of low on your management enhancement points in this chapter, I wouldn't worry about it. See where you can gather up some points in other chapters. And then like Molly said too, you can always circle back and say, okay, how can I meet the intent of this question with some maybe more minor retrofits and adjustments?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that the Vineyard team did not try to make this impossible. And sometimes you just have to work with what you have and the chapters that you maybe excel in. And some chapters maybe you don't get quite as many management enhancements. And if you're working with an older building or a really kind of basic building, this might be one that is a little bit harder to get those enhancements. But like Beth said, you can probably make up for it in another chapter.
Great. Yeah, so that was a really good overview of chapter 3. So let's move over to Craig to go over chapter 4.
All right, so excuse me. This is part of our soils and things and water, but it's about conservation and about water quality. Again, there's a lot of things here that may apply to pre-plant decisions or things that you could have done, which I'll touch on here in a second. The good news is a lot of this stuff is pretty standard practice. So for instance, 4.1.1, the soil must be sampled and tested. That should be a basic part of what you're doing anyway. And if you don't have records going back, you would want to start right away. So if I had just bought a vineyard, one of the first things I would want to do is do some soil sampling. There are some questions. I know I had questions early on in my career. What do I need to do? What does that actually mean? A couple of things you can do. One thing you could do is you could work with a CCA, Certified Craft Advisor, or a PCA, CCA, and have them do the sampling for you because they have experience with how to go about it. It's a little bit time consuming, I admit. I've done a lot of these. But the key thing that you're going to need for this is you're going to need a soil core. an 18-inch soil core. You can find these online. You can find these at some farm supply stores. It's basically a long tube with a cutout in it that allows the soil to get into the core and then allows you to get the soil back out. There's lots of great resources online. Pretty much any lab will have a soil sampling protocol on their website. So if you're gonna, you'll say, I want to send soil samples in, there'll be a protocol for you to use. Basically, you might take 10 or 20 samples, subsamples to make a sample. One of the most important characteristics of a sample is that you're getting soil from where the roots are located. That can be kind of difficult, depending on how deep they are. I think a lot of us are just trying to get down to the 18-inch depth, at least initially. But if you really, really want to see what's going on, you can dig with a shovel, you can dig with a backhoe, dig down in there. That's what they do when they do soil pits. But it's not that hard. And you should be doing it anyway. And like I said, Cornell has a great protocol. Other wine lab or other soil labs that I've looked at have great protocols. And should be something that you're doing regularly. 4.1.2, this is a little bit scary, I think, to some folks in terms of like, well, do I need new equipment? So for instance, maybe I have what you would call like a standard tractor, a tractor that I inherited.
And this standard is about minimizing soil compaction, right?
Exactly. This is minimizing soil compaction. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is to minimize soil compaction. It mentions high flotation tires, track layers, over-the-road equipment. I would start with looking at your tires and seeing what you have, and also maybe talking to your local tractor dealer or servicer, whoever would be the servicer for your tractor, and see what your options are. You may have high flotation tires on there already and not even realize it, because again, those are fairly common retrofits on a tractor, may have been done in the past. Track layers are very expensive. I have only seen ranches where they bought a track layer at the beginning in terms of like, oh yeah, we're going to need this. But over-the-road equipment, again, usually the Vineyard is designed for that. So I would start with the tires and see where you're at, and that's kind of an easy retrofit if you want to get that enhancement. Soil amendment programs. Soil amendments are tricky. Again, there's some great resources out there. The Lodi Wine Grid Commission has a really great article that we can link to about soil amendments, and there's some others from different states. Usually the soil amendments are going to be done at pre-plant. That's kind of your first shot. When you send a soil sample in, even post-plant, oftentimes you'll get a lime requirement with recommendation for how much lime you might want to put on to push your pH up, or a sulfur requirement to push the pH down. Wine grapes like a pH, soil pH with a fairly very particular kind of narrow range. And that's something to consider. You can look and say, well, how much do they say, or how much do they think would be necessary to move things? Again, working with a CCA, very good idea. If you send a sample out and it comes back and looks like things are a little bit out of range, not a bad idea to have a professional take a look at that and talk about what your possibilities are. It's a lot of material usually, and that can be kind of intimidating. The good news is it's not something that you're going to commit to an annual thing, unless you're talking about compost. Compost would also be considered a soil amendment. Lots of folks are composting. Compost is readily available, or at least much more available than it was in the past. And there's different ways to apply it, whether it's banded under the vine row, which is very efficient, or whether it's broadcast. There's more people that are interested in that now for trying to build the soil health of the entire floor. But the most important thing here is making sure that what you're going to do is based on what the plants actually need. And so looking at the plants, looking for nutritional deficiencies or marginal burning, which may be due to some kind of a nutrient issue that's exacerbated by soil pH, that's a first kind of a signal. When you see things like that, sometimes we think of it and we go, oh, well, I'm going to fix this with a fertilizer program. When actually what you need to do is you need to fix it with a soil amendment program, which, like I said, a little bit harder to do when it's a post-plant, but absolutely is doable. And again, I recommend having some professional consulting on that. It's worth it. especially if you limit it to a particular project. Tissue analysis you should be doing regularly, and that's covered also, I think, in another chapter, if I remember right, to make your fertilizer decisions, but also to see, hey, what's happening in terms of what the plant's able to get from the soil. Water, I think we've covered that in other areas in terms of what you're putting on. For instance, I had a vineyard once where I had a high magnesium spot and the plants were really suffering. And so I was putting on a lot of water in that section, trying to overcome the hardness or the grip in that high magnesium soil. Then I got my water analysis back, and it came back that the magnesium content of the water was really high. So I was working against myself. And so we had to think about ways that maybe we could manage that, the way we could deliver water in a different way, or maybe we could amend it with something like gypsum to try to loosen up that soil, and also with compost. So that was a place where water analysis told us about what we maybe need to do in terms of soil amendments. And of course, soil sampling as well. You might find it's high in particular minerals that potentially could be problematic. Or you could say, hey, there's plenty of it in the soil, but it's not being transported. Why? And then you can think about what you might want to add as an example. But usually try to take care of that before you plant, if at all possible. And then go from there. I think compost is kind of a slam dunk on this one. And it's pretty common. Water infiltration, this is 4.1.4, right? 4.1.4. I've seen some creative solutions to this problem. Again, gypsum oftentimes is used, and that can be applied a couple of different ways. It's difficult to get it on through fertigation, but there are machines that will make that possible, so the gyp machine, or it can be banded. All of those are options. Compost, again, compost can really help with water infiltration, but it'll take time. And that's the key with something like that. And that's just a surface application of compost, but over time it will improve it. Also, if you have roots in the soil, that helps. So there's a balance there between like a clean cultivation vineyard where we're using a weed knife, you're knocking down everything before it has a chance to grow, as opposed to maybe a herbicide-based program where you do let some weeds grow up there under the vine in the winter, and then you terminate them with a herbicide. Now that's going to leave some root material down there, which will actually help with water infiltration. That's a decision you're going to have to make based on how you feel about herbicides or not, and also based on whether you're organic certified or not. But there's just a couple of different things you can do, but it's going to take time. So here we're saying, are you doing it or not? Are you addressing it? Just look at it and start. And you can tell if you've got problems. If things are puddling underneath, if things are running off from underneath the drip system, things like that. One option that's not a fantastic option, but I've seen people do, and it did seem to help, was actually digging out a little basin underneath the dripper. So that water can go on and stack up, and then slowly has time to sink into the soil after that, so it doesn't run off. Very labor intensive, obviously, not a perfect solution. You'd rather modify the structure of the soil if you can. Looking at this is 4.1.5. Salts should show up in your water analysis. Also, salts will show up in your soil analysis. Are there things that you can do about that? Again, I would get some advice from a professional in terms of what kind of corrective actions you want to take. That's a tough one. There's areas that have salty soils and salty waters, and you're kind of stuck. But you got to monitor it. The main thing I think when it comes to this is that EC number moving over time? And that's what's going to tell you, yeah, I need to do something or not. 4.1.6, GPS, GIS equipment so that you can actually do a variable rate chemical application. We just did an interview with a specialist in this area for the Sustainable Wine Growing with Vineyard Team podcast. That'll be coming out next year. That technology has been kind of difficult and expensive in the past. That's actually changing now. That's become much more practical. retrofitting or buying equipment, like I said, in the past was very expensive. Now it's becoming less expensive. And so you can move that direction. It's the GIS GPS mapping part that may be a little bit more difficult. And so this is one that I wouldn't worry too much about if you can't do it. It's great if you can do it. If you can't, I would say it's okay. Storage facilities, 4.1.7, containment of spills. This one's often overlooked. It doesn't have to be that difficult. You can build a berm around your storage shed is one way to do it, or some places are built actually with some kind of little containment wall. So that can be a relatively easy thing to get to. What you don't want to have is stuff sitting on the ground on a slope with a leaky roof and things like that. I think a lot of people could probably just spend a little time inspecting their pesticide storage areas and seeing are there things that I can do to improve it. Separating liquid materials, that's 0.8. That's as easy as putting your wet stuff, your jugs on one side and your dry materials on the other, or having two different sheds. The key, though, again, is you don't want to take a liquid and just stack it on top of a bunch of bags of sulfur. So a lot of this is just kind of common sense stuff that you can do. And again, putting the dry stuff above at a higher level than the wet stuff, that's as easy as stacking a couple of pallets in a shed. So that's a relatively easy one to get. Mixing and loading on areas with low runoff hazard, that's number 9. Again, this is kind of common sense. Don't load your sprayer next to a stream. Don't load your sprayer on a slope. And find a spot that's maybe a little bit away from where people normally would work. So one thing I've seen that worked really, really well as far as this is considered is having J fills an air gap filling for the tank. You do need to have an air gap between the tank and the water source, and having them distributed in different spots. Sometimes you can actually, if you don't have that, it's not terribly difficult to tap into an irrigation sub-main to make that possible and have it spread out in space on a flat spot. So if you've got rolling vineyards, you can find the place where the lower spot is and do your loading there. That works really well. And again, shouldn't be that difficult to do. Just don't do something stupid. That probably wasn't the most professional thing to say, but erosion control and prevention offsite movement, that's 4.2. The watershed, knowing your watershed, you should know what watershed or sub-watershed you are in. These are delineated by, I believe, the federal government, but then also they're tracked by the state, by your local resource conservation district. There's a link in there, makes it extremely easy to find your watershed. That's kind of a slam dunk, knowing where you are in the watershed and then also paying attention. The idea here is if you are on the kind of upstream side of a watershed in terms of slope or valleys or things like that, you really need to be careful that you're not letting anything move offsite down into the rest of the watershed. And that shouldn't be that difficult. So a lot of times this is fairly straightforward. Where am I? And then being aware of what the implications are. Winter cover crop, again, that's pretty easy to do. It's very common. That's
Take a picture now would be our recommendation, or coming up here once something starts growing.
yeah, exactly. Just take a nice photo in the wintertime.
And we have about 5 minutes left, so just to make sure we pay attention to time, if there's some big highlights that you want to hit in this section.
Absolutely. Sorry about that.
Great info.
Things like the minimizing sediment, again, pretty standard practices, easy to do. Hay bales are common, wattles, silt fences, but you should do your winterization basically right after harvest. So there's no downtime in this business. Vegetative perimeters makes sense, shouldn't be too hard there. Erosion control plan, just a simple written description of what you plan to do and how you manage it. And that has to do with just looking at your ranch and saying, where are the issues? And you should probably be aware of that already. Cover crop residue maintained during the entire year. Again, pretty easy to do, very common practice. One of the things to look at is every other row. Oftentimes people will cultivate in the winter in order to try to reduce water loss. You don't have to cultivate everything. You can leave some, leave those roots in there. And then the other one that's pretty easy, kind of a slam dunk, is number 11. If you are keeping vegetation from below the vines, just measure what your band is. And your band should probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 inches. So for most rows, that's pretty much slam dunk. And I guess my final message is don't be afraid to reach out for help.
Yeah.
Lots of meetings, lots of things online on this topic. Obviously, offset movement of water is a big deal nationwide, and so don't be afraid to use recommendations from Michigan or Cornell, or even Ohio State or Penn State, California, obviously. Washington State and Oregon State also have lots of resources.
Yeah, we do have some resources linked kind of throughout the standards, but if you're ever going through things and you really need some help, you really need some guidance, reach out to us and we will happily dig into it and find some resources for you. So, and thank you, Craig. That was super thorough. Definitely hit all the requirements and all the easy and difficult things. So let's see. We have about 3 minutes left. We'll open it up for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, you can drop them into the chat and we will address them. I'll give it a couple of minutes.
And of course, if not, we'll be doing these every month through May. We will keep focusing on a couple of chapters at a time, but always bring anything that you're working on that you have specific questions on.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's been a little bit. I don't see any chats coming through. So if you think of anything after the webinar, go ahead and shoot me an email, whitney@vineyardteam.org. And yeah, so thank you again, Craig and Molly, for joining us. This is going to be super useful for people either just getting started with the program or doing the self-assessment, or if they've been in it for years and just, you know, want to learn some extra tips and get some more resources. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right. Cool. That concludes the first office hours. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.